So let's talk a little bit about the things that actually inspired jazz, other types of sort of popular music that combined together to create this monster of a popular genre. The most important of those being ragtime and the blues, but jazz was influenced by many different styles of music from the 20th century. Remember, classical music had gone away from what audiences wanted, so the time was really ripe for a new sound and new style of music to overwhelm the world. And also remember that classical music had led to a new idea of what music actually was and how music should be created. Individualism rather than form and rules was the new #1 thing that was important to musicians and composers across the world. Music was no longer put into different boxes or for a form and had to follow any rules. So, again, the time was ripe for other styles of music to finally come onto the world stage and become acceptable, even if they weren't really related to the classical music histories and genres. I want to mention something pretty important. Remember, as we've talked about before, that society, economics, politics, all of these things put together can help lead to the creation of new styles of music or new ways of thinking about music. And then composers are allowed to take that and run with it. And this was very true of jazz as well. Without the influence of society and how it was recreating itself, jazz would have never developed as a popular style. So while we're going to spend most of our time in this unit talking about the different music styles that developed into jazz and then the characteristics and styles of jazz from the 20th century, you need to know that society, economics, politics, and the power of certain areas of the world really also helped to shape jazz. Think about the fact that much of the world was becoming urbanized. More and more people were flocking to the cities, especially minority populations that thought that if they went to the cities, they would have more opportunity, be able to develop into middle-class citizens, rather than be considered poor, rural nobodies. There was also, at the turn of the century, finally an ability to share music more quickly across the globe. As you heard last week with 20th century classical composers, music was spreading across the world and composers were being influenced more and more by other traditions because they were able to travel more quickly, and then when recording systems were developed, they were able to record music wherever they went. And eventually in the 20th century, as we all know, music has come to be at our fingertips at every moment since it's been digitalized and we can find it in online catalogs at all times. Things like iHeartRadio and YouTube make it possible for us to listen to new musics at all moments. This trend began at the early parts of the 20th century and really gave jazz the ability to be inspired by world musics and then to in turn inspire new forms of music later in the century. Also remember that this was a century of war, disease, poverty and prejudice and racism. And because of these horrible things that we deal with as human beings, there really needed to be an outlet for the emotions of the people that were involved in these terrible riots and world wars. Classical music gave an outlet to people. Romantic music gave an outlet and was very emotional. 20th century modern music was also a way for people to have an outlet, but not all people responded to that music anymore, and since music had diversified, people had the choice to listen to whatever type of music they really responded to. Jazz fell right into a new category of music that gave a new type of emotional outlet to people. They could go to any sort of dance club, bar, any sort of club at all, and they would find musicians playing jazz and other styles of popular music in the corner, and they responded to that music because it was created by men and women just like them, living at the same level as them, dealing with poverty and prejudice. That really connected people to this type of music. This is why society and how it's built really does influence music and will continue to do so through the next generations. As I've said, of course, already, jazz was influenced by other cultures across the world because music was more easily shared and people could travel much more quickly and be inspired by the music of the world. Some of the most important cultural trends that helped to develop jazz were the West African traditional music culture, African American church music cultures, European trends in music, and then American traditions as well. Some of it we've already talked about. We've already talked about their European classical traditions and how they helped and hindered jazz. West African traditional music, it should be pretty easy to realize that since this is an African American minority style of music when it was originally created, that it would make sense that when slaves were brought over to the United States, they developed their own styles of music based off of the music of their homeland. So West African traditional music, which was very percussive and very rhythmic, was oriented towards chanted melodies and spoken pitches and things like that. It was very percussive at its core, both vocally and instrumentally. Those traditions stayed with the African American population after slavery ended, as they dealt with eras of Reconstruction and racism and prejudice, and it helped to influence the first types of jazz. The church music in the African American population also influenced jazz, especially gospel music and call and response music. I would think that it would be a great idea for all of you to go and try and find types of gospel and call and response music if you don't know what this music sounds like. The same for West African traditional music. Feel free to put into YouTube West African traditional music or call and response style or gospel music. You're going to get some great examples of this type of music. Look for older recordings from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that would have been created and put onto a record rather than put onto even a cassette tape or CD. If you find music like this and spend some time listening to it, you're going to better understand jazz when you listen to more styles of jazz later, because you're going to hear these historical influences. Also keep in mind that American traditions were important to jazz because jazz is an American type of music. So it was inspired by the instruments that Americans liked to use, play, and listen to, and it was inspired by the traditions of American citizens. So, most importantly, brass instruments and woodwind instruments as well were considered very important and were used most often in jazz because that was part of the band culture. Stringed instruments in the United States never really caught on as well as the band instruments did, winds, brass, and percussion. That really is something you're going to hear a lot of in jazz. There's a lot of vocal jazz, but most jazz is an instrumental form of music that uses brass, woodwinds, and percussion alone, not really strings. It wasn't until very late in the 20th and 21st century that we got string jazz as a type of jazz that developed, and it's still not as popular today. The other American traditions that you can think of, I've already mentioned gospel hymns from the African American church music that developed in America, but there were dance forms that developed in American bar cultures where people simply wanted to have a drink and dance and blow off steam after work. There were spirituals that developed out of the slavery era, gospel hymns, African American church styles, as well as folk music and work songs that developed from the chain gangs that were popular. If you don't know what a chain gang is, feel free to go look that up. It's basically when during the 1800s and early 1900s, anyone who broke the law, especially African American slaves if they tried to run away, would be forced to work as a chain gang to create railroads or roads and just do menial labor. And they would literally be chained together. The man at the front would lead songs, and all of them would sing these work songs or spirituals together. These traditions were a part of the African American culture of the time and so influenced jazz. Now that you know how jazz developed in relationship to society and world traditions, we need to know a little bit more about the types of music that came before jazz that actually helped to create jazz. Jazz comes from two specific music traditions in the United States, as well as the societal influences and the other world traditions we've already talked about. Those two types of music are ragtime and the blues. Read about them in your book. I'm going to discuss them very briefly here, and then listen to the example of each type of music so that you really understand the sound of the music that came before jazz that was at least sort of popular. But something to keep in mind, ragtime and the blues were not popular forms of music at this time. Ragtime never developed full popularity in a large population, but the blues eventually, in the later part of the 20th century, became a genre all unto itself, and it's still popular and used all the time today in lots of different traditions. But these two styles of music that developed around the turn of the century had really unique sounds that combined together helped to create jazz. Ragtime, most popular from about 1890 to 1915, especially the ragtime music of the composer Scott Joplin, was a style of music that was developed by African American pianists. These were men and women who were given a job playing in bars and saloons across the southern United States and in the Midwest. These bars would usually have a piano in the corner, not usually in good condition. Usually it'd be missing keys, it would be out of tune, it would sound quite terrible. So these African American men who were playing the pianos in these bars had to develop styles of music to entertain the guests that were at the bar and help them blow off steam at the end of the day. Ragtime is dance music. It's music that's supposed to make you happy while you drink at the end of a long day and make you feel happy enough to go home and just get a good night's rest before you go on to a terrible day at work the next day. Because remember that most of these men and women that were working, African Americans, they did not have good jobs, if they had any jobs at all, because they were still living in a very prejudiced and racist society and were not on equal footing with the other cultures in the United States at the time. Because this is only 20 to 30 years after the abolition of slavery, and people still did not see them on even terms. So these are men and women who were living in a time of prejudice and adversity that simply wanted music to listen to that would calm them or make them happy enough to dance off any bad emotions from the day to go home happy. Ragtime was a great way to really make them feel happy, get them dancing, and make them go home happy. Ragtime in its essence is a type of music that is in duple meter, which means that it's divided into sets of 2 beats. It's in a moderate march tempo that really related to the patriotic and band music that was popular at the time, so that was another way that people connected with this music. And most importantly, while one hand playing on the piano, the left hand, held a steady beat and created that sense of duple meter consistently, the melody, in the other hand, was played in a very syncopated way. In other words, you never quite knew what was going to happen in the melody. It sounded unexpected. It sounded spontaneous. Accents were in the wrong place. The rhythms were interesting. It kept the music exciting and lively, but still gave you a beat to dance to. Ragtime never became a really popular style, like I said, outside this small area of the United States, but it was well known and liked by African American populations, and these pianists who developed and performed ragtime are some of the first musicians that developed and performed jazz. So your first listening example for this week is actually not a jazz piece. It's instead a piece of ragtime called The Maple Leaf Rag by Scott Joplin, the best ragtime composer of that era. Listen for the syncopated melody and also listen for the steady beat, and think about whether you'd be able to dance to music like this or might be able to at least blow off some steam and enjoy it at the end of a long working day. The blues, at its essence, are 2 things. The blues are a style of vocal and instrumental music and a style of performance. Both aspects are important and must be there in order to have a piece that's known as the blues. The blues came from the work songs and gospel traditions of the African American culture in the United States, developed in the 1890s, and are still in play today. As I said, it really wasn't a popular form until much later in the 20th century. Blues and its sound and form really influenced a lot of new popular styles, especially early jazz. Without it, jazz would be a completely different type of music. We're going to talk about the blues more later when we talk about rock and roll, because it also helped develop rock and roll. So keep in mind that while we talk about the blues in passing in this course, we're never going to have the time to really talk about blues as a genre, mostly because blues is so hugely popularized and so diversified that it would take weeks to go through every style of blues that exists. In talking about jazz and rock and roll, we talk about 2 genres of music that are actually so heavily influenced by blues that some people consider them to be types of the blues, even though they've become more popularized and are forms unto themselves. So read about the blues in your book, learn about the blues, and try to really think through what the blues are as a form of music and what it sounds like as a performance style. But understand that just like with ragtime, it was kind of an unimportant, unpopular style at the turn of the century that was only popular with little pockets of the population and with a minority population at that. So at the time that jazz developed, it took the ideas of the blues and the ideas of ragtime and combined them together into the perfect popular form for the time. And it just simply exploded from there. The blues later in the century do become popular on their own terms, but really the blues are the thing that fundamentally and historically form jazz, rock and roll, and other folk traditions in America. So have fun learning about it. You are responsible for reading about it and trying to know what the 12-bar blues are, how the chords are used to create the repetitive form. You're required to know about Bessie Smith and some of the other singers and songwriters that developed the blues, and know about the urban centers that really made blues what it is today. But keep in mind that we're trying to understand blues from the perspective that blues helped create jazz at this time. The blues were not a set style at this time. It was simply a developing popular style that morphed into jazz, as well as other styles of music later in the century. So I really think in order to best understand blues and the influence it had on jazz, you need to listen to a piece of blues. And the book has picked out a great example this time. I really like this one. It's just a fun piece. Bessie Smith was an African-American woman that was considered to be the empress of the blues, and she wrote this song and then performed it in 1926. It's one of the earliest recorded examples of the blues, especially one sung by a woman. Many, many people have sung this, and I hope you enjoy the version I've got for you off YouTube. It's really great performance. Listen to the form of the song, see if you can follow the pattern of it after you've read the text about it, and listen to how the elements are combined, how she performs this piece of music, how it's actually sung, because all of these things are the things that really influenced composers and musicians to develop jazz. So finally, we can really get down and dirty with jazz and talk about what it is and how it sounds, and listen to a lot of fun musical examples. Jazz was written for the first time around the turn of the 20th century, and it really stemmed from these ideas in ragtime, the blues, the world music sounds that we talked about, the American folk and church traditions. And musicians and composers took all of those elements and combined them in new ways to develop jazz as a genre and style. Jazz is music that has soul and has emotion. It's music that connects with an audience. It has structure. It uses the blues form and other forms, but it was also very free to be created in the moment through improvisation. Jazz is music that used the instruments of the people, the band instruments they liked listening to, the piano that was so popular in the bars and saloons. Jazz is music that was inspired by the depth of the human voice and soul and the words of all races, classes, and genders. Jazz really took the ideas of the common man and incorporated them into the vocal and instrumental forms of the music. And jazz used the elements of music that we have talked about so many times this semester in new ways and combinations to really create this new type of popular style. So now, finally, you get to listen to a little bit of jazz. Go listen to examples 3 and 4 at this point. Really enjoy listening to them too. I've given you 2 very different types of examples here. But I want you to listen to them just to kind of get yourself listening to the influences of blues and the influence of ragtime in this type of music. See whether you can hear the influence of the world music, the percussion aspects of things, the grooving syncopated melodies, the steady beats that you would have found. Do you hear any call and response? Do you hear gospel tradition? What do you hear without knowing anything else about jazz when you listen to this music? The example 3 is an actual live concert from 2009 given by Wynton Marsalis, a very, very famous jazz trumpeter from current day, and his band. I love this 60-minute video of the performance. I'm not requiring you to watch all 60 minutes. Feel free to listen to it while you're doing other things and just enjoy the music at this point, because this example is for your listening pleasure. It's not testable. So feel free to just enjoy the music while doing whatever else you're doing and have fun with it. See whether you get you or your families dancing to the music, or whether you respond to the slower, more steady jazz. But you can have you watch these men create jazz, whichever piece from the 60 minutes you choose to listen to, or all of the pieces you choose to listen to. Watch them when they're playing off of the music, or when they have their eyes closed and they're just making up something on the spot. It's great music, and these are the best jazz artists of the day. Example 4 is completely different. This is a song called One Note Samba. It is sung by Ella Fitzgerald, one of the greatest jazz singers of the 20th century. She's famous for being able to sing in a style called scat. Scat singing is when a singer tries to improvise a melody or create a melody completely at that specific moment and make their voice sound like an instrument. There are many different scat singers of many different styles. Others that you can look up include Sarah Vaughan, or even Frank Sinatra used to do scat occasionally. But I just think this is a fun example. She's out of breath and chatting with her audience, and then she jumps right back in and sings a song that has a melody, but she just makes things up the whole time, trying to sound more like a jazz trumpet player than an actual vocalist. It's a fun example. Enjoy listening to it. And once you've listened to these examples, move on to the lecture about the characteristics of jazz, and then the jazz styles, lectures 1 and 2.